Sometimes the people who make us laugh the hardest are hiding the deepest ache. In Miss Doubtfire, Robin Williams does not just put on a wig, glasses, and prosthetics. He becomes a father, trying to stay close to the children he loves, even when love alone is not enough anymore. There are movies we remember because they made us laugh. And then there are movies we remember because somehow underneath the laughter, they told the quiet truth. Miss Doubtfire arrived in 1993, disguised as a family comedy. It had Robin Williams doing voices, dancing with a vacuum, falling over furniture, and turning a simple dinner into one of the most chaotic restaurant scenes of the decade. It was broad, warm, quotable, and endlessly rewatchable. The kind of movie that felt permanently attached to the family VHS shelf. But the reason Miss Doubtfire lasted was not just a comedy. It lasted because it understood something painful about divorce, childhood, and the strange shape a family can take after it breaks. Robin Williams plays Daniel Hillard, a gifted voice actor, a loving father, and a deeply irresponsible husband. When his marriage to Miranda collapses, Daniel does not respond with patience or maturity. He responds with desperation. And that desperation comes in the form of Mrs. Doubtfire, the Scottish nanny who enters the Hillard home as a disguise, but slowly becomes something more complicated. Directed by Chris Columbus, the film lets Robin Williams run wild, but it also lets Sally Field stand firm. It gives us a fantasy built on deception, then refuses to make the lie simple. Because beneath the makeup, beneath the accent, and beneath that unforgettable hello, Mrs. Doubtfire is really about a man learning that loving your children means growing up for them, even when that growth comes far too late. What makes Mrs. Doubtfire so interesting is that it does not begin with a disguise. It begins with the damage. Before the wig, before the glasses, before the padded suit and the Scottish accent, we meet Daniel Hillard as a man who is wonderful with children and exhausting for adults. He is playful, imaginative, spontaneous, and full of life. To his kids, he is magic. To Miranda, he is chaos. That tension is what gives the movie its emotional foundation. Daniel is not presented as a villain. The film knows why his children adore him. He turns an ordinary day into an adventure. He fills a house with laughter. He makes childhood feel larger and brighter. But the film also knows why Miranda is tired. She is not trying to destroy the family. She is trying to survive the burden of being the only adult in the room. That's why the birthday party scene matters so much. On the surface, it's funny and energetic, with music, animals, noise, and total disorder. But underneath, it tells us everything. Daniel sees joy. Miranda sees irresponsibility. The kids see the best day ever. The adults see a breaking point. For a 1990s family comedy, that was surprisingly honest. Divorce in movies was often softened, simplified, or turned into a temporary obstacle. Mrs. Doubtfire treats it as something messier. It hurts everyone, even when that hurt might be necessary. That is the emotional trick of the movie. We understand Daniel's pain when he loses daily access to his children, but we also understand why it happened. The film asks us to love him without fully excusing him. That balance is what keeps Mrs. Doubtfire from becoming just another high-concept comedy. The premise may be outrageous, but the wound underneath, it feels real. Robin Williams was one of the few performers who could make chaos feel human. In Mrs. Doubtfire, his comedy comes at full speed. Daniel Hillard is a voice actor, a mimic, a walking radio dial of personalities, accents, noises, and characters. The movie gives Williams room to do what he did better than almost anyone. Turn a simple moment into a runaway train. A phone call becomes a performance. A job interview becomes a one-man sketch show. A family dinner becomes panic, disguise, and disaster. But what makes the performance last is not just the speed, it's the sadness. Daniel is funny because he's trying not to fall apart. After the divorce, the comedy becomes a survival instinct. Every voice, every joke, every wild idea is part of a man trying to avoid the truth that his family has changed and that he played a part in changing it. Williams let us see the childlike wonder in Daniel, but also the immaturity hiding behind it. That's what separates Daniel Hillard from Mrs. Doubtfire. Daniel performs to escape responsibility. Mrs. Doubtfire, strangely enough, teaches him responsibility. Under the makeup, Daniel starts doing the things he avoided before. He cooks, he cleans, he listens. He shows up on time. He pays attention to what his children need instead of only what he wants from them. The disguise begins as a lie, but it forces Daniel into the daily work of parenting. Ed Williams understands that contradiction beautifully. He makes Mrs. Doubtfire hilarious, but never empty. She is a character, a costume, and a cover story. Yet, through her, Daniel becomes more honest than he ever was as himself. That's the quiet heartbreak of the movie. Daniel has to pretend to be someone else before he can become a better version of who he already was. For Mrs. Doubtfire to work, the disguise had to walk a very thin line. If the makeup looked too fake, the whole movie would collapse. If it looked too real, it might lose the exaggerated warmth that made Mrs. Doubtfire feel like a storybook figure who somehow wandered into a San Francisco home. The film needed the audience to believe Daniel could fool his family, but it also needed Mrs. Doubtfire to remain expressive enough for Robin Williams to perform through layers of prosthetics. That challenge fell to the makeup team, led by Greg Canham, V. Neal, and Yolanda Tussing. Their work became the film's greatest achievement, eventually winning the Academy Award for Best Makeup. And it's easy to see why. Mrs. Doubtfire is not just a mask. She is a full character design. The round cheeks, the soft jawline, the gray wig, the glasses, the cardigan, the pearls, the floral dresses, everything works together. She feels old-fashioned, practical, comforting, and just theatrical enough to be funny. The design tells us who she is before she even speaks. But the real magic is that the makeup still allows Williams to be Williams. His eyes remain alive. His mouth can still twist into panic, sweetness, sarcasm, and sudden terror. When Miss Doubtfire is calm, the disguise feels incomplete. When Daniel panics underneath it, the face becomes a part of the comedy. That is why the famous restaurant sequence works so well. The disguise is believable enough to hold the illusion, but fragile enough to make every mistake feel dangerous. In a movie all about performance, the makeup becomes more than a technical trick. It becomes the physical symbol of Daniel's lie, his love, and the strange person he has to invent in order to finally see himself clearly. Chris Columbus understood family movies. By the time he directed Mrs. Doubtfire, he had already shaped the emotional language of childhood on screen from writing Gremlins and The Goonies. He knew how to build comedy around kids, houses, chaos, and adults pushed to their breaking points. But Mrs. Doubtfire required a different kind of balance. This was not just a movie about children finding treasure. It was a comedy about divorce. That meant the film had to be funny without making the family's pain feel meaningless. Columbus lets the movie have big, ridiculous set pieces, but he keeps returning to the emotional cost of Daniel's choices. That is especially important in the way Miranda is written and performed. In a simpler version of this story, she could have just been the cold mother standing in the way of fun, but the film gives her dignity. Sally Field plays Miranda as tired, hurt, and deeply human. She loves her children. She has carried the practical weight of the household. And when she finally says she cannot live like this anymore, the movie does not treat her as wrong. That choice gives the film its maturity. Daniel may be the comic center, but Miranda is the moral center. She is the person who forces the story to admit that love is not enough without responsibility. Columbus also avoids the easiest ending. Daniel does not simply get the family back because he learned a lesson. The marriage remains over. The family changes shape. And that is what makes the movie feel honest. Mrs. Doubtfire gives us fantasy, but it does not pretend divorce can be erased by one grand gesture. Sometimes healing does not mean going back. Sometimes it means learning how to become a family in a new way. What gives Mrs. Doubtfire its emotional weight is that the children are never just background pieces in Daniel and Miranda's story. Lydia, Chris, and Natalie each experience the divorce differently, and the movie understands that. Natalie is young enough to still live in the magic of her father's imagination. Chris feels the confusion and anger more directly. Lydia, the oldest, sees the truth with painful clarity. She understands both how much Daniel loves them and how much damage his choices have caused. That's why the discovery scene matters so much. When Lydia and Chris realize Mrs. Doubtfire is really their father, the moment could have been played for farce. Instead, there is something almost heartbreaking underneath it. They are shocked, but they are not simply laughing. They are children realizing that their father has built an entire lie just to stay near them. For Daniel, the disguise feels like devotion. For the kids, it's more complicated. It gives them access to the father they miss, but it also places them inside the deception. Suddenly, they're a part of the secret. They are asked, silently, to carry the emotional weight of an adult's desperate decision. That is one of the reasons Mrs. Doubtfire has lasted. The comedy is huge, but the children's pain feels recognizable. They don't want a perfect legal arrangement. They don't want court orders, schedules, or explanations. They just want their family to feel whole again. And in the end, the movie has to teach Daniel the same lesson it teaches the audience. Loving your children does not mean pulling them into chaos. It means becoming stable enough that they do not have to manage your heartbreak for you. Every great comedy needs a conflict, and Mrs. Doubtfire finds the perfect one in the restaurant scene. By this point, Daniel has become too confident in the lie. He has managed to fool Miranda, stay close to the children, and build a second life inside his old home. But lies do not remain still. They grow. They demand more effort, more cover stories, more quick thinking. Eventually, the performance that once gave Daniel control becomes the thing controlling him. That's what makes the restaurant sequence so brilliant. Daniel is forced to become two people at once. Himself at a professional dinner with a television executive, and Mrs. Doubtfire at Miranda's birthday dinner with the family. He runs between tables, changing clothes, changing voices, changing posture, changing faces. It is pure comedy gold, but it is also the entire movie compressed into one scene. Robin Williams plays it like controlled panic. Every exit feels too late. Every entrance feels like a miracle. The audience laughs because the timing is absurd. But underneath the laughter is the certainty that this cannot last. And then comes the choking. For one brief moment, the lie stops mattering. Daniel sees Stuart in danger and acts. Not as Mrs. Doubtfire, not as the jealous ex-husband, not as the performer trying to keep the show alive. He acts as a person who can help. But in saving Stuart, he exposes himself. That's the cruel irony of the scene. Daniel's most selfless action is the one that destroys the disguise. The mask finally comes off, not because he confesses, but because reality forces its way through the performance. It is funny, embarrassing, chaotic, and painful all at once. And once Miranda sees the truth, the fantasy is over. The movie can no longer be about whether Daniel can keep pretending, and becomes about whether he can finally grow. The ending of Mrs. Doubtfire is what gives the movie its lasting emotional power. A simpler comedy might have restored everything. Daniel would apologize, Miranda would forgive him, the kids would cheer, and the family would return to the way it was before. That would have been easy. It also would have betrayed the honesty the movie had been building from the beginning. Instead, Mrs. Doubtfire lets the marriage remain over. That choice matters. Daniel does grow. He becomes more responsible. He proves that he can show up for his children. He turns Mrs. Doubtfire from a private deception into something public and healing. A television figure who speaks directly to kids going through the same confusion and sadness his own children experienced. But his growth does not erase the damage. It does not undo the lie. It does not make Miranda's pain disappear. And that's why the final custody arrangement feels so moving. Miranda does not take Daniel back as a husband, but she recognizes him as a father. And that distinction is everything. The movie understands that a family can be broken and still be loving. It can change shape and still be real. Children can live between two homes and still be held by both parents. The old version may be gone, but that does not mean every good thing is gone with it. Robin Williams' final monologue as Mrs. Doubtfire gives the film its thesis. Some families have one mommy, some have one daddy, some have two families, some live in separate houses, but love, when it is steady and present, can survive the rearrangement. That is why Mrs. Doubtfire remains more than a comedy about a man in a disguise. It is a movie about accepting that love sometimes has to mature. Sometimes the happy ending is not getting back what you lost. Sometimes it's becoming the person your family needed all along. Nearly 3 decades later, Mrs. Doubtfire still plays like comfort food, but it does not survive on comfort alone. It survives because it lets us laugh at something painful without pretending the pain is not there. It understands the absurdity of family life, the chaos of parenting, the heartbreak of separation, and the strange ways people try to stay close when they feel themselves being pushed away. Robin Williams gives one of his most beloved performances, not just because he's funny, but because the comedy feels like it's covering a bruise. Daniel Hillard is not perfect. He lies, he manipulates, he makes selfish choices in the name of love, but he also changes. And through Mrs. Doubtfire, he learns that being a parent is not about being the favorite. It's about being dependable. It's about listening. It's about showing up when the joke is over. That's why the film's final message still lands. Families do not always look the way they once did. Sometimes they split. Sometimes they stretch across different zones, different routines, different versions of the future. But love can remain. Mrs. Doubtfire gave us the catchphrases, the restaurant chaos, the makeover montage, in one of the most iconic disguises in movie history. But underneath all of that, it gave us something gentler. A reminder that the mask was never the miracle. The miracle was the man underneath, finally learning how to become a father.